Thank you everyone for staying with us this morning. So welcome to the Energy Transition Panel. The theme of this plenary panel is plugging into greener and sustainable energy. Even as the world undergoes energy transition to sustainable sources, Africa is at the forefront of distributed energy systems that can increase energy access faster than conventional systems. At the same time, the ongoing market dynamics of carbon-based fuels could hold unfavorable consequences for some of the continent's biggest economies. This panel will address climate change's impact and discuss the challenges and opportunities in the energy transition phase. The moderator for this panel is Amaka Anku, who is the practice head of Africa at the Eurasia Group. Over to you, Amaka.
Hi, I think you have to let me start my video. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Great. Okay, where are my panelists? Can they also come on video? I see Afosha's here, Humphrey's here, Ryan is here.
Yeah, we're here. I think.
Yeah, we're here. I think we need to be enabled to get on video.
Get on video, right? Okay, yeah. So Ryan's up. Wait, there we go. Here we go. I'm just waiting for Afosha to come on too. I think that one more person.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you to everyone. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm really excited for this conversation. And Bongiwe did a great job of introducing it. We only have about 50 minutes to have this really important conversation. So I am going to skip reading all of your wonderful bios. I think everybody listening can find them online so that we can dive right into the discussion, right? So I want to start with sort of big picture. Off the back of COP26, everyone's been talking about this, and well, even before COP26, this global energy transition. What does it look like if you're, and I often wonder, is it really a transition for African countries? So let's just start with that. What does the global energy transition look like from an African perspective? And I'll start with you, Afosha. Am I saying your name right? Is it
it's Afosha. You're close.
Okay.
Yes.
I asked my husband how to say your name. All right. Let's start off with you. What does this look like from an African? What does the energy transition mean or look like from an African perspective?
Okay, so Amaka, thank you for that question. And I should also say thanks to Priscilla and the conference organizing team for having me and my distinguished panelists on here. I'm really excited and honored to be here. And just to state quickly for the record, I'm speaking here on my own behalf. And not speaking for the government of the Republic of Ghana. So just to sort of...
Sorry, I meant to say this. So I'm not going to read your bios, but the first time you speak, can you just 1 or 2 sentences on what you do? So that's okay for everybody.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yes, I should say first of all that I'm a Hoya, law class of 2010. And I'm currently special advisor to the finance minister of the Republic of Ghana. And my portfolio is mainly energy and power. So that's what's been keeping me busy since 2017 when I joined the government from the private sector.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So going to the question, like I was saying, global energy transition often assumes, well, for most of the world, it's about transitioning from sort of certain types of dirty fossil fuels to more renewable energy. for most of Africa, we're still talking about getting people access to electricity, right? Like much less transition. And so I guess what's from the African government perspective, what does it look like? Is it focusing first on access? Kind of how do you think about this global energy transition? Kind of big picture question to start with.
Okay, good question, Amaka. And the lawyer in me wants to start with definitions so that we're clear on exactly what I'm responding to. I think that it's fair to say that there's no universally accepted definition for energy transition, but it's been generally described as an inevitable shift away from cheap, centralized, largely fossil-based fuels to greener, more sustainable energy. And I think the literature, therefore, speaks to two broad categories of definitions. The first one, I think, speaks to a structural change in a country's energy ecosystem that is significant and not ad hoc or temporary. The second one, I think, is the one that speaks to the one that gets most people really excited is the transition away from fossil-based fuel to zero carbon greener energy. I should also mention that the energy governance discussions also include other aspects of energy, such as access, affordability, equity, and justice, which I'm sure we'll be touching on at some point during this discussion, as all being vital elements of a country's energy system. Now, speaking specifically from sort of the Ghana experience, which is what I know, I think it's probably safe to say that energy transition, in the broad sense of structural change in a country's energy system, has in fact occurred in Ghana. However, the sustainable energy transition to greener energy hasn't quite yet occurred. And to be more specific, the two elements of the structural changes that have occurred include one where we have basically transitioned away from exclusively hydro energy to a regime with significant thermal complementation, so that you have a hydrothermal mix with thermal comprising about 70% of the current generation mix. And then we have also transitioned from an exclusively state-supplied energy ecosystem into one that comprises state-private sector supply mix. So currently we have about 56% of our generation coming from independent power producers. Renewable energy, our policy currently in Ghana is targeting 10% renewable in the energy mix by 2030, and a provision of renewable energy to about 1,000 off-grid communities by 2020. So renewable energy constitutes currently about 1% of the current mix, and there's still quite a considerable reliance on fossil energy for vehicular transportation. So now I'll pivot a bit and speak to a very exciting government intervention that I was brought in to lead and drive. So I'll be speaking from the point of view of someone who has actually been directly involved in engineering a deepening of Ghana's energy transition. And this we've done through bilateral engagements and renegotiations with about 6 or 7 of Ghana's IPPs. So in 2017, when I joined government, we inherited a regime where we basically had over-procured power. So we had installed capacity that was almost double peak demand, and these were mainly on a take-or-pay basis. So basically, you're paying for power even if you don't consume it. because of the nature of the take-or-pay obligations that we had locked ourselves into on a very long-term basis. So we're paying about $500 million for power that we weren't consuming. So 2019, government said, look, this is unsustainable. We've got to do something about it. So I was brought in to lead these discussions with IPPs that have, as we speak today, resulted in about $13 billion worth of savings for government. And this is what we've basically done through these bilateral discussions. We've negotiated a number of interventions. So part of it is for our project finance IPPs. We're pursuing a refinancing of expensive foreign debt to the tune of about $1 billion. So we went to the Eurobond market in 2020, in February 2020, raised about $3 billion, and we ring-fenced $1 billion. We've set up an SPV that we're then using now to take out expensive foreign debt. We've also negotiated a transition to a tolling regime. So we're basically, this is another structural change whereby we're moving away from the power purchase regime into an energy conversion regime, where government is actually taking fuel risk away from IPPs and through contract compelling them to burn cleaner natural gas, which we have an abundance of. There are other interventions that we've negotiated, like term extensions and tariff sculpting. But overall, this exercise that, like I said, I've been leading was designed to reduce costs, but it morphed into a restructuring, a reform of the energy sector. And I must say that with the savings that we've secured, I think we've put ourselves in a better position to be able to afford and absorb more renewable energies as we look forward to transitioning into a cleaner, more green energy space in Ghana.
Thank you, Patrick. Let me just follow up on something that I thought was interesting. You said earlier, did you say that the current renewable mix is 1%?
It's under 1% installed, yes. But the policy target is 10% by 2030. So
are you including hydro in that? No? Because that's
no.
That's an interesting, I guess I'm curious to hear how other people, so do people not include hydro in the definition of renewable? Because it should be cleaner than
it should, and I mean for the purpose of this discussion, I'm not including hydro because we do have our thermal hydro mix is about 70-30, so we have about 30% hydro. But for the purposes of speaking of the transition to renewables, speaking of solar, wind, yes. So that's exactly what I was saying.
So the reason I kind of zoned in on that, because I think that's a fascinating problem. So Ghana's energy mix used to be dominated by hydro, right? Until a few years ago, when, in part due to climate change, you were having problems with the hydro, with the Akosombo Dam, and which led to the, electricity blackouts crisis that then led you to add so much more thermal fossil fuels in your. So this, to me, underscores a tension that we've been seeing in this sort of push as people are saying, okay, well, we want people to move away from dirty fossil fuels and into renewable energy, but in an environment where so many people don't have access to electricity, or where it's difficult for, in Ghana's case, your hydro wasn't able to meet demand, in part because of climate change, right? So how do we, I'm curious to bring in anybody else who wants to jump in here. How do we reconcile this tension between the need to close the energy gap in a lot of African countries? Like in Ghana's case, there was a crisis and you needed energy ASAP, couldn't afford to do it with solar or whatever. Hydro was already problematic because of climate change and reduced rainfall. So do you do more? There are fossil fuels, right? Because at this point, people need energy access. How do you kind of think about that tension between the need to close the energy gap and transition to more renewable, cleaner energy sources. Chitapedi, do you want to jump in here?
Well, hi, Amaka.
Am I saying your name right?
It's TPD.
TPD. Okay,
Yeah.
great. TPD.
So,
if you don't mind, just tell us a little bit about what you do and then jump in with you.
Excellent. So I'm with AfCFTA. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for AfCFTA. And I think if you can indulge me, Amaka, just to let people know what AfCFTA does.
Yes.
So AfCFTA is an infrastructure investment platform that was actually formed by African governments, seeing the need to meet the infrastructure development gap and funding gap on the continent. And current shareholders are 28 African governments, 2 African central banks, and the African Development Bank, who's really our anchor. But I think before I address that question, just wanted to say congratulations to the Georgetown Africa Business Conference organizers. It seems like a very incredible day that is set out. I wish I could stay for the whole entire session. But I think most importantly, I'm hoping for those who are passionate about the continent, that they see that the incredible opportunities across everything from entrepreneurship to institutions such as ourselves that are looking to do our part on the continent. So you ask a very good question, right? How does one balance the needs, right? So I think the way I look at it is, one, on our continent, our levels of development or low levels of development industrialization require a different approach, or at least a balanced approach. Number 2, as you rightly said, our low levels of electrification. From an electrification perspective, we've got 600 million Africans who still do not have access to power. Thirdly, it's the intermittency of renewable energy. So I would look at hydro power as actually a renewable energy because it's the use of water, running water without having to diminish it. It's just the recycling of it, so to speak. So I think as you rightly said in the opening that Bongi also made is COP has really highlighted the urgent need for all countries to reduce emissions to net zero, right? So that's the premise of it all. And I think African countries also realize that need, right? 49 of them have ratified their commitments to the Paris Climate Agreement. And already many are pushing renewable energy and implementing that. I think South Africa, Egypt, Uganda, Morocco, we're seeing many of them who put together, renewable energy IPP programs to drive that. But I think most critically, what we've seen is the extreme weather patterns on the continent, right? And disproportionately affecting our continent. So it's a reality. Climate change is a reality. Floods that we've experienced in Southern Africa, droughts that we're experiencing in the Sahel and East Africa, the losses of livelihoods, losses of lives, displacement of people. So climate change is a reality. However, despite all of that, we must be allowed to balance the pressing needs with regards to emissions reductions. Really balance the pressing needs between emissions reductions as well as developmental, right? So I think that to me is absolutely critical. The key thing for us, is that while we are addressing these development needs, while we're limiting the emissions and transitioning towards renewable energy, it's really important that one takes into consideration what natural resources we're endowed with, right? So certain countries will have hydropower in large quantities or access to. In certain countries, you've got radiation, which is absolutely significant. So in Southern Africa, great radiation, therefore a great ability to tap into solar power. In certain countries, you're going to have wind where you can have access to, right? So it's critical that we look to see what works in each country. I think the other important thing that came out of COP for us has been gas, right? So Europe initially had come out and said they will not fund, or certain European countries in North America had said they will not fund gas as a transition fuel. There's been a change. I think this winter has shown that actually a transition away from gas does not necessarily make sense. So now the EU Commission, Sustainable Finance Taxonomy has turned around and basically said, we will look at gas or fossil fuel gas as a transition energy to net zero. This is very important for the continent as a whole, right? 40% of the most recent gas discoveries have been on the continent. And therefore, for us as a continent, it's critical that if we're to drive industrialization, if we're to drive proper development, we need to tap into gas as a transition energy to net zero. It's cleaner than coal. It's cleaner than the HFO that most of our countries are using. And when you look at it, even from a cooking fuel perspective, there's so many losses of lives because of the cooking fuel that we currently use. So even that, using liquefied gas as a cooking fuel makes a huge difference for our economies as a whole. So completely on board with, yes, it's important that we move to renewable, but we need to think about most of our transitioning to net zero in a just way. I think sometimes we forget the just transition requirements and balancing the fact that renewable energy is still, the intermittency of renewable energy is not going to be beneficial for us if we're looking to industrialize as a continent as a whole.
So let me just do a quick follow-up to kind of close the loop on that. So when you say we need to be allowed to tap into gas, I'm assuming you would say then that even if it means increasing emissions in the short term, we should be looking to build more gas-powered power plants with some goal of then eventually, even if it's increasing emissions now, with a goal of, at some time in the future, transitioning from gas to something else. Is that specifically what you would, how you would
It is,
say that?
but let's also be clear, Amaka, that Africa only contributes 2% to energy emissions. And global emissions, we only contribute 4%. Right. So I think one needs to also take this in context to actually say, so, and if one is to remove coal from the mix, as one is to remove HFO, those emissions will come down significantly because gas is still a much cleaner form of fuel than the current sources, being coal being a significant contributor, especially in the Southern African countries, and in West and Central Africa, where we're still using heavy fuel oil.
Yep, great. So let me bring in Ryan here. So why do we have these current realities of there being such a big population without access to electricity, right? I'm sure, that's a big question. So let me kind of take one slice of it. People often say that there's not enough financing for power, increasing connectivity to the grid or increasing gas production. Is the problem about financing? Is it something else, right? Like, what do you think from the private sector, from your experience? And also same thing, tell us a little bit about you and what you do, and then we can delve into the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, and thank you for that. And I should say that I was a one-time organizer of this conference, so, and obviously Ahoya, so glad to be back and glad to see everyone. So I manage project development for a kind of commercial and industrial energy company. So we focus primarily on developing renewable energy projects and financing kind of small private utilities. And we're based in Kenya, but kind of work across the continent. I think from my standpoint, we as a company are lucky in that we're endowed with a kind of in-house source of capital for our projects. So, we're not going out to the market every time we're doing a new project. I'm just, going across the hallway to chat with kind of the guys that manage the actual fund. And so that kind of speeds up, access to capital. That being said, we we do focus, in our commercial and industrial solar business, we do focus on, I'd say kind of medium and some small businesses. So we're not just looking at the Unilevers and Coca-Cola as kind of the easy from a credit standpoint clients. We're trying to kind of look a little deeper, look smaller. And the reality is that requires a huge amount of work on our side to essentially create credit assessments, create credit profiles for all of our clients. And I think, if we didn't have, access to our own capital, that would slow down project development immensely. And even with our own kind of in-house capital, we, getting the client on board with lower cost renewable energy is, I'm sure Humphrey can share this. That part's easy, right? Going to a client and saying, hey, would you like to save money on your power bills? Often they say yes, surprisingly. But the real challenge is then saying, okay, if you're going to finance a project over a 5, 10, 15, 20-year period, how can you be sure that the client is creditworthy? And in our case, that involves a huge amount of work, and that slows down projects, and that means that we're not deploying capital as quickly as we could. And so I think, to the extent that we can, and this is obviously not really in the remit of the energy sector, but to the extent that kind of credit tools can be improved and that African countries can kind of work closer with credit bureaus to really kind of expand those tools, that would be really critical to projects, both for us and I think for others.
So are there in particular, so just to be clear, just to make sure everybody understands, so Ryan, you're talking about private sector clients, like industrials, like big companies that can afford to basically go off the grid and create their own energy solution, right? Like whatever, like captive energy. So if your challenge isn't financing, because you guys bring the financing to the client, are there any other challenges that you face in doing this? So is it sort of mostly, well, client wants to save money, you can help them save money by bringing this alternative source?
Yeah, I think, the one other challenge that I've been thinking a lot about recently is, we do a lot of our business in countries like, Kenya and Tanzania, where, there's a relatively low risk, in terms of kind of the politics, the larger economy. And, it's great. We do a lot of great work in Kenya, for example. But, when we do look to develop projects in, kind of less developed markets on the continents, it does get a lot harder, even with our own capital, to make sure everyone's comfortable with long-term risk. And I think the challenge that I have had and the frustration I've had is that we will then go to both the private market and to DFIs for insurance products, let's say. And, everyone says, oh, we really want to get involved in C&I solar. We really want to get into this sector. It's really exciting. And then even if you go to them with a relatively large C&I project, so let's say a $1.5 million project, which for C&I is pretty big, it's too small. And they say, well, we'd like to get involved, but it's too much work and it's too small. So maybe next time. And I think without some of those kind of backstopping products, it's hard to look beyond kind of the Kenyas, the Ghanas, the Nigerias, and into some markets where there's more need, to be honest.
Got it. So I'm going to go to Humphrey now, but I think then I would like to kind of talk about what this means. Like what Ryan is talking about is effectively taking off-grid large industrial companies that in most countries you could argue should be subsidizing the grid for poorer, customers, right? So I'd like to get Foster's views on, what, if any, tension, if that can create tension sort of in the grid system. But first, Humphrey, what's your perspective on sort of what the bigger challenge is? So taking out the private companies that are kind of developing their own energy access solutions, what do you see as the biggest problem that's the reason for why there's still so many unconnected people, right? When we were talking to PD about, this is why we still need to potentially increase gas, because we still need to connect so many people to electricity. Why is that? And what's the major challenge that is prohibiting electrification?
Great question. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Humphrey Rekul. I'm an associate principal with Cross Boundary Energy Access, which is part of the Cross Boundary Group. So Cross Boundary Group, we are an investment firm that focuses on using private capital to make an impact and return on underserved markets globally, with a large focus on Africa. My team being Cross Boundary Energy Access, what I focus on is energy access. So bringing power to those 600 million people on the continent that do not have access to electricity. And we do so through the use of mini grids. So if you look at those 600 million people across the continent that don't have access to power, the most cost-effective way to bring power to over 200 million of them is through private mini grids. The issue is that these private mini grids have had trouble gaining finance in the past. And so what we do is we use project finance in order to invest in the mini grid sector at scale. We started off with a small pilot about 3 years ago to commit $18 million, that's 1/8, into mini grids in Tanzania, Nigeria, and Zambia. And now we're scaling with a $150 million blended finance platform. So that's concessional capital, equity, and debt in order to continue financing mini grids at scale on the continent. So for me, I guess maybe slightly different perspective than the others on this panel is that I'm focusing specifically on how we bring power to those rural communities that currently don't have access to electricity. So if you're not familiar with what a mini grid is, you can think of a community of 500 houses off the beaten path in Nigeria that doesn't have access to power, no access to the grid at all. What a mini grid development company will do is they'll come on that site, work with the community, and work with the regulators as well. And then they'll build a mini grid, which is simply a set of generation assets, typically using solar power, as well as batteries for storage and diesel to make sure you have 24/7 uptime. You also put all the poles and wires in the ground. You put meters on each individual house, and you connect them all, and you create a very small version of the grid that you and I are used to today. And then those people, over time, slowly paying electricity, they pay back that investment. As you can imagine, that's a high cost to connect these folks. And because of them being, in essentially marginalized communities, they don't have the financial capacity to pay you a lot. And so thus it makes it a very difficult investment to make, especially from a private sector perspective. So circling back to your question, Amaka, why do a lot of these people not have access to electricity? It's simply a math question, right? They're expensive to connect, and they don't have a lot of money to pay you back. So that's why the utilities, and when you look across the continent, these government-owned utilities, I think only 2 of them are financially stable, are able to actually pay their costs on an annual basis. The rest are all underwater. The rest are all loss-making, right? So they can't go out and connect these customers who are expensive to connect and don't have money to pay you back. And that's why you need the private sector to step in alongside donors in order to bring power to half the continent.
Well, I mean, that raises a question people often ask, that I've heard people ask, which is that a sustainable way to connect everybody, right? Like, do we really want just a bunch of mini grids everywhere? Do you lose some of the economies of scale of just having a few, like a national grid, right? How do you think about that, right?
And so when you look at the folks that are not connected,
anybody can jump in for the next question. Yes, go ahead.
So when you look at the folks that are not connected to electricity right now, right? And there are about 600 million of them. About, let's say 250 million of them are best connected to by mini grids. And the way you do that math is just simply by looking at the distance they are from the current main grid, as well as the population density, right? And so those 2 things tell you the most cost-effective way to connect everyone on the continent. For some people, they're close enough to the main grid and their population is dense enough that it's cost-effective to just extend the main grid and reach them. Others might be close to the main grid, but don't have a very dense population, so you can use solar home systems or individual solar systems for each of those houses. And then, and so you can just use different combinations there to determine what's the best way to connect everybody. And I'd say, yeah, it is sustainable and effective to use a combination of these technologies to bring power across the continent. If you look, for example, to the United States or to Brazil or to China, and you see how they reached their rural populations in global electrification in their countries, they subsidized it. They subsidized it for long periods of time. So this isn't an African problem. It's not a mini grid problem. The question of bringing power to rural populations it's a rural electrification problem. And it's been solved many times across this country. Across the world. It's a question of, are you willing to have the appetite and the patience to subsidize this product across the continent in order to bring universal electrification and all of the benefits that come from it.
Great, and I want to make, if Tapiti or Foshri can comment on this question, which is, so Humphrey, I thought you did a great job of kind of highlighting the two main problems, right? Like customers are too poor, they're often very high collection losses, right? So there's not enough money to reinvest in the, at least from the state utility, they're not collecting enough. There's no money to reinvest in expanding distribution. But there's also a problem of often tariffs being too low, right? Because they're trying to subsidize everybody. And I'm curious, anybody jump in here. What do we, other than building these mini grids, which are, I think you've made a good point that it is sustainable to do a combination of both. What else can or should we be doing, or are you guys doing to close that gap in a sustainable way, right? Is there, for example, a role for government to, like, is it part of the problem with increasing tariffs or no, right? And are there any concrete examples of solutions that are scalable? Like success stories somewhere, whether it's mini grid or like a state utility that has managed to become efficient and collect enough to reinvest and expand. Like, what are some of the examples, success stories that we can say we should scale this experience in this place or that place? Anybody can jump in here.
Yeah, Amaka, I think I could touch on that a little bit. Look, you mentioned earlier about the tension.
Yes.
And it's real, right? Because it is sort of, so if you look at the Ghana situation where we have a relatively high cost of generation, and as I mentioned earlier, I was brought in to help really mitigate that and bring some of those costs down. When you have such high costs of generation, you have non-cost reflective tariffs on the back end, and now you have government in the middle that now is compelled to subsidize electricity. It's not sustainable, and yet you run the risk of a regulator making it a little more difficult than may be necessary for private sector intervention by protecting an inefficient state utility, right? So there are things that government can do, and that we're tackling now to ease that tension, because clearly, certainly in Ghana, from where I sit, our view is that the private sector is the ideal engine of growth. And so we should not be in the business of making it more difficult to facilitate the same growth that we want. So some interventions, for example, that we're looking at is creating helping or facilitating the creation of a regional power pool, so that some of that excess capacity that we have can be offloaded, right? Because at the end of the day, even if you have to take a haircut on tariffs, it's better than not. So overall, I think you want an ecosystem where your state utility is not being protected in an anti-competitive way, so that Ryan can come in and help expand access and reach the off-grid communities that actually need the electricity reliably and on an affordable basis.
I want to switch gears a little bit, and then I want to ask, I don't know, the host, let me know how, are we taking questions via chat or orally? You can just let me know in the chat. But I want to switch gears a little bit and ask about the tension that we uncovered at the top, which was that climate change is causing extreme weather, which is making, like, some countries, especially on the East Coast, have quite a high level of renewable in the energy mix, right? Usually, especially hydro. Kenya has all sorts of renewable in its energy mix. But in part because of climate change, hydro has become more unreliable, right? So how will that impact, I guess, anybody's views on how the fact that weather is becoming even more unpredictable, how will that impact the transition part of the energy transition? So we've been talking about two things: getting people more access, and then also transitioning, right? And what does that mean for what we do? Like, should we be looking for different kinds of renewables? Should people still be investing in hydro? Should they be focused on something else? Should the focus be on gas for now? And then, so, like, how do you think about that? The fact that climate change is itself complicating this transition. Anybody wants to jump in?
So, Amaka, I don't think it's mutually exclusive or binary, right?
Okay, great.
I think critically one needs to look at what is it that we have as baseload energy, right? And then you need to think about peaking, right? So in the instances where one knows rainfall may not be sort of from a season perspective, we've got low rainfall that's going to impact our hydropower plants. What then do you have that can provide sort of that bridging fuel energy to the grid? So I think when we look at energy as a whole, one needs to look at the fact that what do we have as baseload, what do we have as peaking plants, what do we have to take us through the certain seasons? And to be honest with you, I think we're all learning, right? Europe just recently had to fire up certain of the coal-fired generation plants because there wasn't enough wind, right? So I think as we go along, we're realizing that some of the renewable energy, as I said earlier, is not as reliable. So that base load, which more often than not for many of our countries is potentially going to be gas, especially along the East Coast, is going to be necessary for us.
Okay, I'm looking through the questions. A lot of them we have answered already. So I'll try to weave them in as we go along. But to the question of what you were saying, governments can help. One of the things that I hear often from private, in places where generation and distribution has been privatized, like Nigeria recently, is that tariffs are just too low, right? And I understand the tension that Humphrey was highlighting, right? Which is a lot of people can't afford to pay. And so there's often a desire on the part of governments to subsidize it so that there's some level of access for everybody. And anybody can chip in here, but I find this to be kind of one of the biggest dilemmas in the energy sector in Africa, which is that tariffs are too low. It's often politically very difficult to raise tariffs to a level where it makes sense for these companies to be reinvesting without improving access to begin with, right? People are like, why should I pay more when I'm not even getting any electricity? I didn't have any electricity for 2 days. Why should I pay more, right? And yet, if you don't pay more, there's no money to invest in expanding the grid and distribution. So, how do you think about that from a government perspective? And anybody else can chip in here, right? Which is, can you, raise the tariffs and maybe do it simultaneously?
Yeah, Amaka, look, go ahead, Humphrey.
I can give a slightly different perspective because it's less of a government perspective and more of a private sector, our private mini grids perspective. When we build mini grids, we aren't charging the government tariff because mini grids.
You are not charging the government?
We do not.
Higher or lower?
Higher. These customers are expensive to connect. And as a result, we are a private company, and we go in jurisdictions and in countries where we have a cost-reflective tariff or something that's close to a cost-reflective tariff, and it's up to us to reduce those costs enough. Now, what we found is actually quite interesting, because these customers, the people are willing to pay a higher tariff for a quality service. The issue isn't the tariff. The issue is when I'm paying for electricity, but I don't know when it's going to be there. I don't know if it's going to be there tonight or not for my family or for my business. But once you are able to provide a quality product, we've had several instances where people have made it quite clear they're willing to pay more for something that actually works. I'll just leave it there.
I think Humphrey makes a very good point. So I think we talk about cost-reflective tariffs. The reason why a lot of the tariffs could be extremely high is because of the technology that we're using. Many of the generation assets that we have on the continent are being run by state utilities, have not been maintained, and therefore the cost of operating them is going to be high. We're seeing that the tariffs that are coming through newer technologies, through newer generation assets, are actually quite affordable. And I think, Amaka, one needs to balance that with, okay, fine, I'm paying a low tariff, supposedly low tariff, but I'm actually need to have a diesel generator in my backyard, which is even more costly. So I think completely echo Humphrey's point, which is I'm willing to pay more as long as I know that I get something that is reliable and is constant. So I think currently that's what we're dealing with. Actually, the cost of electricity for a normal citizen is actually quite high because I've got to have a diesel generator and I need to pay for my diesel.
Okay.
It
sounds like, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I want to look at this from the cost of generation side of things as well, right? Because, when you say cost reflective and you have really, really high costs of generation, it becomes very tricky, right? Because you can only increase end user tariffs so much before you trigger civil unrest, right? So, and Amaka, that, tariff setting in Africa, in many markets is very political for that reason. Yeah. So focusing on the generation side, and again, this is the exercise that I'm leading, we're seeing, for example, for project financed IPPs, we're seeing, per megawatt costs, as high as $3 million. $3 million, $2.7 million per megawatt for utility scale thermal CCGT is extremely high. The benchmarks that we've seen, the World Bank has shared with us, you're looking at, $1.5 million. And the narrative has been, and this is something that we've, if you've been following Ghana at all, you would have heard my minister, make it clear that we pay too much for capital in Africa. So your project finance IPP, they come in, for a 20-year PPA, you get, 12-year debt at 12-15%. It doesn't even match the tenor of the PPA. And you're seeing payback periods of 4 to 6 years, very heavily front loaded. So tariffs on the generation side are extremely high. I think we can expand this conversation into why do we pay so much for debt, for equity in Africa? And we've said that, and I share the view that, some of these Bretton Woods institutions need to be at the forefront, helping us engineer an ecosystem that is more fair and balanced, so that we're not paying so much for capital. Because power infrastructure is very capital intensive, and it's, I think, given the nature of the problem that we're trying to solve now, the global nature of it. Because if I'm sitting in Accra and I'm polluting, suddenly it's affecting everyone. It's affecting you in China somewhere. So we need to be looking at this thing holistically because clearly a big chunk of the discussion about tariffs and the cost of electricity is indeed the cost of generation. That I think, there are things that we can do, like I said, as government that are within our control. But then there are other things like the cost of borrowing. We go to the Eurobond market. We're seeing on some of these, project finance IPPs, IRRs of, 18, 20%. So this is a real problem. And until we're looking at how do we finance, development of utility scale power in Africa in a sustainable way, I think this transition to net zero is going to be challenged for us.
Yeah, just to jump in on that. I hear you when you talk about the Bretton Woods institutions and everybody doing their part, but I think from an African government perspective, we also need to do our part.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
We need to make sure that we've got the enabling environment in place.
Absolutely.
We need to make sure that we've got the requisite regulatory framework in place. So I think it's, we've got capital that's coming from the private sector that wants to know that my rights are going to be protected. So I think we have to take a very balanced approach to this and say, as Africans, as African government, let's do our part to ensure that we create an enabling environment to attract the capital at the right price.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think it's critical.
Yeah.
It sounds like, just to summarize a little bit, it sounds like a part of what we're saying in terms of solutions, and I want to bring in Ryan, is that maybe governments should be a little bit braver, or maybe invest in educating people that we need to raise tariffs in order to raise the quality of the service, right? So that you can do both, you can balance both, right? Because to the private sector, people here are saying, like, you need to pay for the service, right? And so that needs to be, it seems to me, and that's also, in my view, a part of creating the enabling environment. Because I think that a part of the reason that it's hard to attract capital, of course, there's lots of global structural issues for why capital is expensive in Africa, but there's also the fact that tariffs are not cost reflective. So people might be looking at it and saying, well, who's my off-taker going to be? Are they going to raise prices when the currency depreciates 30%, right? Like all of that factors. So it seems like there needs to be kind of maybe, in addition to trying to figure out how to get capital lower, price lower, but also maybe more investment in educating people that maybe prices need to go up in order for quality to be better. Ryan, you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Well, I think one thing, just to aggressively agree with Futsu earlier, like, I think this is such a well-trodden path. Clearly, there's an unfair risk weighting, even for economies like Ghana, like Kenya. Even those economies pay a cost of debt that is ridiculous, right? And again, to my earlier point, the problem gets so much larger when you start to look at markets like Congo, right, or South Sudan, where there is heightened risk, but actually getting financing or insurance for projects is almost impossible. I think there's a need for some of these DFIs to maybe be a bit braver, I think is where I'll leave it. But I think, in terms of more cost reflective tariffs, I think that's where, not to focus too much on GridX, but that's where companies like GridX can help, because, we're not coming to these businesses and taking them fully off the grid, right? They're still using, 60, 70, 80% of their power consumption is coming from the grid. We're supplanting, 20, 30% at a much lower tariff than what they're paying to the grid. And so as a result, their blended tariff is lower and they're saving money on what they would have been paying. And you could argue that they could stomach a bit of a tariff increase as a result. And so I think, creating an enabling environment for companies to, invest or find financed options for, kind of captive renewable generation is critical, because that'll really help both ease the burden on the utilities and, allow for tariffs to increase a bit.
I'd just like to contribute there, because I think we shouldn't be focusing on quite a lot of things I've touched upon. So Ryan, I'm completely in agreement with you. Sometimes the perception of risk on the continent is way higher than the actual risk, right? So agreed there. But I just wanted to touch on the point around tariff. I think the focus shouldn't be on increasing of tariff. As I said earlier, what we're seeing is the additional capacity that's coming on is actually reducing tariffs, right? So the cost of delivering and generating power is coming down tremendously. We're seeing that in some of the plants that we're putting in place. You know, we're currently developing 420 megawatts in Cameroon. And the expectation is that because we're going to be generating power at a much lower cost than currently, that should be able to pass on to the consumer, to the end consumer. The second part, just getting to Ofuso on the funding, and we're talking about sort of cost of funding being high. I think too often we look externally. We've got an asset management business or a pension fund industry that has $2 trillion of assets under management, right? So this is local currency. So the question for us is, how is it that we tap into the pension fund market on the continent to be able to fund some of these projects? How is it that we deepen our capital markets to be able to tap, to be able to fund many of these projects? So I think because there's a whole lot of risk, right? So how is it that we defray the foreign exchange or the currency risk between dollars and local currency, right? I think so it's important that as we go forward, how is it that we try and unlock additional sources of capital? I think Humphrey spoke earlier around blended finance, so I think it's critical, but we also need to look at how is it that we introduce local currency financing into the mix for some of these projects that we're undertaking.
And good point. If I might just speak to that quickly. And you're speaking my language, right? And one of the interventions that we're driving here is, like I said, we've ring-fenced about $1 billion from our 2020 Eurobond raise that we're using to refinance expensive foreign debt. And we're seeing that from that financial engineering and intervention alone, we're seeing tariffs on the generation side drop by as high as 44%, 26 to 44%, which is considerable. So as you mentioned, the government of Ghana is really like putting skin in the game now. We've set up this SPV. We've seeded it with $1 billion. The plan is to raise an additional $1 billion to get the fund to $2 billion. And we're going to use that to really clean up the sector. So we'll probably be looking to co-invest and be taking equity and debt positions in power infrastructure and development. And tapping into domestic capital markets with local currency, using long-term patient capital from pension funds is also something that we're looking at. So I think these are all things that are within our control that we can also do to facilitate the cost of reducing cost of power.
It's important to note that, just really quickly, that these challenges look different across the different countries, and it just happens to be that there's only one government representative here. But power tariffs in Ghana are actually quite high. They're really low in Nigeria, for example, right? Like maybe, so some people might need to do more on that than others. But very quick, anybody has there's this question that came in: why is solar energy not at the forefront of Africa's energy mix, given that Africa is so endowed with lots of solar energy? If anybody can answer this in 1 minute, let's go there. I can think of some answers, but I'm sure one of you have better answers. Battery?
So I could, yeah. So I mean, I can say, for example, using the Ghana example as an experience as an example, where you have excess capacity, any new additional capacity you're bringing on, you're actually adding to your problems, right? And given the mass dispatch nature of solar, unless the marginal cost of dispatching solar is lower than your thermal, then you don't dispatch it. But where it in fact is, then you have an issue of stranded assets. Like I said, we have these long-term take-or-pay agreements, and you're paying for it whether you consume it or not. So the more solar you bring, the more you're kind of compounding your problems. That is one way to look at why, as much as there is a commitment to drive the renewable energy mix to 10%, there's still challenges that we have to confront along the way.
Right. And with
I think one way to work on that a bit is to be a bit creative about where you're siting it, and not just view it as part of the general grid mix, but put solar installations closer to clients that are going to use it. So closer to industrial areas where they have heavy loads throughout the day. You know, I think there's ways to increase it without kind of increasing the risk as well.
And I'm sure you guys, other people know better, but I've heard that a part of the problem is that it's you know, storage is not as easy for times when there isn't, you know, currently solar, right? Like it's still quite expensive to store solar energy, and that is probably part of the reason why it's not going to be sort of the large scale solution for grids right now, right? So with that, we're at 11:01. So I just want to thank everybody. This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you to the organizers, and I hand it over to whoever else is going to take up to introduce the next panel. Thank you guys. Thank you everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.